The lake at Harlan Mills, New Hampshire does not care about your plans. It sits between two slopes of pine, flat and silver, and completely indifferent, the way only very old things can be indifferent. It was here before the road. Before the white clapboard house on the hill with the navy shutters. Before the boathouse cottage where a woman kneels in a herb bed on a Tuesday in June, pressing her thumbs into dark soil, listening. She hears it before she sees it. Tires on gravel, expensive ones, moving too fast for a road that ends at water. She stands, wipes her palms on her apron. In the kitchen doorway behind her, a 6-year-old stops painting and holds a brush up like a question. A black SUV crests the lane. The man who steps out is wearing the wrong watch for a lake. He looks at the main house. He looks at the cottage. He looks at her. And the summer begins to go sideways in the best possible way. The lake at Harlan Mills, New Hampshire does not care about your plans. It sits between two slopes of pine. Flat, silver, indifferent. The way only very old things can afford to be indifferent. It was here before the road. Before the white clapboard house on the hill with the navy shutters. Before the caretaker's cottage where Laura Clark was on her knees in the herb bed on a Tuesday in June, pressing both thumbs into the dark soil where the rosemary had gone leggy and needed turning back. The soil was cool. It smelled like rain from 2 nights ago and something older underneath. Pine resin. Glacial rock. The mineral patience of New Hampshire ground that had been here since before anyone thought to build a road through it. She heard the car before she saw it. Not wrong like a mistake. Wrong like a word spoken in the wrong language in the wrong room. The sound of expensive tires on Riverstone registered in her body before her mind caught up. Some animal alertness lifting the fine hairs along her forearms even though the morning was warm. She sat back on her heels, wiped both palms down the front of her denim apron, the one with the frayed pocket she kept meaning to mend. In the kitchen doorway behind her, Wren stopped painting. Wren was 6 years old and had been painting the same lake for 40 minutes, which was a new record. Usually the painting started as the lake and became something else. A horse, a planet, a detailed architectural rendering of the house they were going to build someday that had, in Wren's vision, 17 rooms and a slide instead of stairs. But this morning she had been very serious about the lake. She had mixed 3 different blues. She was as upset that the water didn't look wet. Now she held her brush up like a question mark. Laura put one finger to her lips. Wren understood. She set the brush down across the paint tray without being asked, which told Laura more than anything else that the sound of the car had registered on her too. 6 years old, and already she had learned this particular stillness. Laura did not know whether to be proud or heartbroken about that. Some mornings it felt like both at once. Stay where I can see you. The rule Wren knew without being told. The rule they had worked out together in the 2 years since they'd been at Harlan View. The 2 years since Laura had taken the caretaker position from old Gerald Marsh, who'd held it for 23 years before his knees gave out. Stay where I can see you. If a stranger comes, stay where I can see you. Not because the world was full of danger, Laura had explained once, but because strangers sometimes had needs that adults had to sort out first. Until those needs were sorted, it was better to stay visible. To let your mother see your face. Wren had nodded very seriously and asked if this was like when you were playing cards and you needed to keep your hand close to your chest. It was exactly like that, Laura had said. The car door opened. The man who stepped out was tall, not unusually tall, but tall in the particular way of men who have spent their whole lives being the tallest person in most rooms and have learned to carry it without thinking. A slight forward lean, as if they're always crossing a threshold. He wore a charcoal gray jacket that was too good for any place within 40 miles of this lake. Dark trousers, a white shirt open at the collar. And the watch, Laura noticed the watch immediately, not because she knew what it was. She wasn't the kind of person who catalogued watches. But she knew what it meant, the dull, warm gleam of old gold against a tanned wrist. The kind of piece that didn't come from a store you walked into off the street, the kind that got handed down, the kind that remembered someone. He had dark hair gone silver at both temples earlier than it should have. The lean build of a man who had swum regularly, or had once, and the muscle memory hadn't left him. He was standing in her gravel drive, looking at the main house up the slope. The white clapboard with the navy shutters, 3,000 square feet of New England propriety, with the expression of a man trying to reconcile a map with a territory. Then he looked at the cottage. Then he looked at her, Harlan View Estate. His voice was the kind that did not need volume. Old money clipped and certain, the kind of voice that had gone to the right schools. Not because the right schools made you sound that way, but because if you sounded that way from birth, the right schools recognized you and opened their doors. I have a confirmed reservation. Laura stood all the way up, brushed the soil from her knees. She was 38 years old, and she had learned a number of things in those years, and one of them was that she did not need to apologize for being dirty in her own herb bed. That's the main house. She nodded up the slope. This is the caretaker's cottage. I'm the caretaker. I live here. He reached into his breast pocket, produced a folded sheet of paper, heavy stock, cream-colored, a brokerage seal embossed at the top, and held it out without walking toward her. He was letting her come to him or not. He wasn't assuming approach. She went to the bottom of the porch steps and took the paper. Read it. The address was correct. The property name was correct. The dates were wrong by 2 weeks, and the listed accommodation was Harlan View Estate in its entirety, which meant someone at a desk somewhere in the city had conflated the cottage address with the estate listing and clicked confirm and sent this man. Scott Hill, the paper said. Hill Hospitality, Manhattan. 4 hours north to a lake house that wasn't ready for him. She folded the paper back along its original creases. Handed it back. There's been an error at the brokerage, Mr. Hill. The main house opens to guests on the 20th. The cleaners aren't scheduled until Monday. She kept her voice even. Not unkind. You're 2 weeks early. He took the paper. Looked at it as though it might have changed. Pressed the pad of his thumb against the band of the watch. Just once, briefly, and she filed that away without knowing yet why she was filing it. Behind her in the doorway, Wren had returned. She stood at the threshold, with the not-quite-wet lake painting still in her hand, watching the man in the drive with the focused, assessing interest she brought to things she hadn't yet classified. She had a smear of cerulean blue on her left ear. Mama, clear and decisive the way Wren said everything. Is the man lost? The man looked past Laura at the child. Something in his face did the thing that faces do when they're caught between one expression and another. A small tightening, a recalibration, and then the careful arrangement of politeness. But underneath it, for just a half-second, something else. Something that looked almost like recognition. It seems I might be, he said it to Wren directly. Not in the talking down to children voice Laura had learned to identify and distrust. A regular voice, aimed at a regular person who happened to be 6 and holding a painting of a lake. Then to Laura. Is there a phone number for the brokerage? There is. They don't pick up until 2 o'clock. She checked her watch. 12:40. There's also the matter that the intended lodge, Harlan Lodge, up in Harlan Ridge, is managed by a separate firm, and the caretaker there hasn't been reached. The brokerage error means you may not have a clear path to your booked property before Monday at the earliest. He processed this. No visible frustration, which was, she had learned from Gerald Marsh's stories about the summer people, unusual. The summer people were usually frustrated. The summer people usually had someone to call, who would fix things immediately, and they were not accustomed to the gap between the problem and the fix. I'll wait then, he said. If you'll permit me to wait on your porch. The word permit. She had not expected it. Permit implied she had something to grant or withhold. It implied he understood that this, the porch, the steps, the herb bed, the kitchen where Wren's paintings dried on the dish rack, belonged to her in some meaningful way, not just in the property management sense, but in the sense that mattered more than that. She noticed the shift in her own shoulders. Noticed it and noted it and set it aside. All right, she said. There's water in the pitcher on the table. The shade moves to the east side of the porch by 3. Don't go up to the main house yet. The cleaners come Monday. Understood. He came up the 3 painted steps without looking at her, and went to the far end of the porch and sat in the wicker chair with his back straight and his ankles crossed. He didn't take out a phone. He didn't take out a laptop. He looked at the lake the way you look at something you've been told, exist but haven't believed in until this moment. And he waited. Wren came to the porch railing, rested her chin on it. Studied him the way she studied paintings. She wasn't sure she was done with yet. What's your name? Scott. I'm Wren. I'm almost 7. A pause in which she organized additional information by order of importance. We live in the cottage. Mama keeps the big house ready for people. You aren't people. Scott Hill looked at the child with the blue ear and said, without irony, without the performance of finding her charming. No. Apparently I'm not. It was, Laura would think later, the closest thing to a joke that a man like that probably knew how to make on the first afternoon of a summer he hadn't planned to spend somewhere he hadn't meant to arrive. She did not let him see her smile. She went back to the rosemary. He did not move. She noticed that too. The brokerage picked up at 2:14. Laura heard him from the kitchen window, where she was turning the burner down under a pot of split pea soup she had not intended to cook for two. She'd started it because Wren liked soup when the afternoons turned cool, and she had a habit of feeding forward, cooking for the hour coming rather than the hour she was in. He stood very still at the porch railing with his phone to his ear. No pacing, no gesturing. The men she'd known who paced when they talked on the phone were usually managing someone. The ones who stood still were usually managing themselves. She watched the stillness. Years of practice, at a specific kind of composure that didn't come cheap. The call ended at 2:38. He came down off the porch, stood in the gravel drive, with his back to her kitchen window, shoulders level, then turned and climbed the steps and knocked once on the kitchen door frame. Knocked. On the open door frame of her own porch. Did not push the screen open and walk in, which was what most of the estate's temporary residents would have done by now, not out of malice but out of a deep and unconscious assumption that spaces near them were spaces available to them. He waited at the frame. They've confirmed the error. His voice was even through the screen. The booking system listed Harlan View Estate at this address when the intended property was Harlan Lodge at Harlan Ridge. They've offered to arrange transport to Harlan Ridge this evening at their expense. Then you're sorted, Laura said. Kept her back to him, stirring. Harlan Lodge is held by a separate firm. The property owner is in Florida, and her caretaker has not yet been reached. The brokerage cannot confirm the keys will be available before Monday, possibly Wednesday. They've offered a hotel in Concord in the interim. They have. A pause. The pause of a man deciding whether what came next was permissible to say. I had cleared 10 weeks specifically to be away from the city. The lodge is on a lake. My intention was to be at a lake. Laura set down the wooden spoon, turned the burner to low. She did not turn around yet. There was a version of this moment she had learned to be careful about. The version where someone stated a need in the general vicinity of her life and waited for her to solve it. The version that started with an inconvenience and ended with her reorganizing things around someone else's requirements. She had lived in that version for a long time. She had paid a significant price for it. She turned. I'm trying to understand, she said, why that's being said to me. He had the decency to register it. A small adjustment in the line of his jaw, not quite a flinch. Something in that direction. Because the main house is empty for 2 weeks, he held her gaze, not defiant, just steady. Because the brokerage has agreed to apply my booking against any property they can substitute. Because I would rather pay you directly for those 2 weeks than drive an hour tonight to a property I haven't seen in a town I wasn't promised. And then, the word I want to use is frankly, but I'm aware that's a word people use when they're giving themselves permission, so I won't use it. She noticed that he'd caught himself. The main house belongs to a family in Boston who hired an estate management company to handle their summer rentals. I'm their on-site caretaker. I do not have the authority to sublet it. The cleaners come Monday. The linens are being replaced Tuesday. And there's a sommelier arriving Wednesday to catalog a wine cellar I've been specifically instructed not to enter. A sommelier. His name is in an email I'm not going to look up. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement. Something in that general neighborhood wearing different clothes. I'll wait until the 20th, he said. She stopped stirring entirely. I'll find a guest house in the village. My legal team can reach the Boston family. If they decline, I'll spend the summer in a hotel in Concord and tell myself it's what I wanted. But I'd like to ask, before I leave your porch, whether you would consider letting me stay in the loft above the boathouse. The soup made a low sound, folding over on itself. From somewhere on the lake came the flat knock of a boat hull against a buoy, and then silence, and then the same sound again. The room above the boathouse. I can see the dormer window from the yard. Yes, it has a cot. No bathroom, no kitchen, no insulation to speak of. I'll use the outdoor shower Gerald Marsh put in off the east wall of the boathouse. She looked at him. The bathroom and kitchen are in the cottage, she said. My cottage, my space. My daughter's space, I know. You said you'd eat in the village. I did. But you'd need the cottage for the shower. I'd need the outdoor shower, he said, which Gerald Marsh built on the boathouse wall. I looked at it when I walked the property. She hadn't told him to walk the property. She did not say that. $120 a night. Which I recognize is more than the main house lets for at peak season, and I'm offering it voluntarily, not as leverage. She repeated the number back. Heard it in her own voice. $120 a night for a cot in a loft with no bathroom. Paid to a man she'd met 40 minutes ago, whose only documentation was a misaddressed reservation. and a watch that remembered someone she'd never know. He confirmed it without flinching. She made herself think clearly. She was not someone who made decisions in the heat of a moment, not anymore. Not since the decision that had resulted in 3 years of a life she'd had to dismantle carefully and relocate herself and a 9-month-old to a lake in New Hampshire to begin again. She thought in steps now. Mr. Hill, she waited until he met her eyes. I have to feed a 6-year-old and replace a porch board. The carpenter quoted me $490 for a single warped plank. I'm not bargaining with you. I'm telling you so you understand the arithmetic I'm doing. Whether $490 is worth letting a man I don't know sleep 90 feet from my daughter for 14 nights. He didn't perform a fence. He took the math indirectly. The way you take a measurement, something to work with rather than something to be hurt by. Of course, he said. I haven't said yes, and it's not mine to say. If I do say yes, I write down rules and you sign them. If you break any of them, you leave the next morning. No discussion. I would expect nothing less. She turned back to the soup. She needed a moment she couldn't explain. The word permit was still doing something to the back of her mind, and she didn't have the language for it yet. Wren came in from the porch then, where she had been listening to the entire conversation through the open door, with the focused attention she brought to things she had decided were important. She stood beside her mother at the stove and looked up at the screen at the tall man on the other side. Mama, very serious. Is the rich man going to sleep in the boathouse? I'm thinking about it, sweetheart. Wren turned and looked at Scott Hill through the screen with the particular gravity of someone who has been asked to form an opinion and is taking the responsibility seriously. He can have the blue blanket, she said. The one with the boat on it. It's too small for me now. Through the screen, the man called Scott Hill did the smallest thing with his mouth. Not a smile. The location where a smile would be if he'd been recently reminded of how to make one. Thank you, Wren. He went back down the porch steps. He stood in the gravel drive with his hands in his jacket pockets and did not look at the boathouse loft, not once, as though afraid that looking would constitute a presumption. The black SUV waited in the drive like a punctuation mark at the end of a sentence nobody had finished writing. Laura stirred. The soup went dark green, folding. By 6 she had written a set of rules on a yellow legal pad. 8 items, numbered, specific. No unannounced entry to the cottage at any time. The outdoor shower available between 6 and 9 in the morning and between 5 and 7 in the evening. No guests. No contact with the main house or its grounds without her explicit permission. No interaction with Wren outside her presence without her explicit permission. All meals taken off the property. Full departure by 8 in the morning on the 20th. At any point, if she said leave, he left that day, that hour, without requiring a reason. She passed the pad through the screen's thick 614. He read it, read it again. Took out a fountain pen from his inner breast pocket. An actual fountain pen, the kind that required deliberate maintenance, the kind that had been chosen, and signed at the bottom. Dated it. Passed it back. By 7 he was eating split-pea soup on the porch from the bowl she'd passed through the screen. Listening to Wren explain the specific differences between great blue herons and green herons while the light went gold over the lake. He ate everything in the bowl. He listened without interrupting. When Wren said that the great blue named Henry was bigger and meaner than the smaller bird, who didn't have a name yet, Scott Hill said, "What are you going to name it?" And Wren said she hadn't decided. She needed to observe it longer before she could be sure. And he said that seemed like a good approach, that you shouldn't name something until you knew enough about it to name it right. Wren found this satisfactory. By 9 he had carried his own bags up the narrow outside stair to the boathouse loft, without asking for help and without making it a production. 2 leather bags and a flat case she recognized as holding a rod and reel, probably expensive. He didn't ask where to put things. The loft was 12 feet by 14 with a cot under the dormer, window and a bare bulb, and the sound of the lake moving underneath everything. By 10, when Laura stood on the cottage porch in the dark and watched the boathouse window light up yellow above the water, she understood something she couldn't entirely name. She had done something she couldn't undo. She did not yet know the half of it. He didn't sleep the first night. The cot was narrow and the lake was loud in a way that a person accustomed to 17 floors above a midtown Manhattan street was not prepared for. Not loud like noise, loud like presence. The soft hollow knock of water against the underside of the boathouse floor. The creak of the rope that held the rowboat to its iron ring. The small regular thump of the boat nudging the dock piling when the lake shifted in its sleep. He lay on his back with his hands folded on his chest and listened to a sound pattern he hadn't heard since a school sailing trip at age 12. When he'd stayed up all night on a dock in Connecticut listening to the Long Island Sound and thinking it was the most alive thing he had ever been near. At 3 in the morning, he gave up, went down the narrow outside stair in his socks and stood on the dock and looked at the lake. The cottage was dark. The main house up the slope was darker. The moon was a thin nail paring above the tree line, and the lake was still except for the slow breathing in and breathing out of water that had nowhere to be and, all night, to be not there. He pressed his thumb against the watchband. His grandfather had bought the watch in a jewelry store in Hartford in 1962, the year he married, and had worn it every day for 41 years, and had given it to Scott's father, who had worn it for 6 years before dying in a car accident on the Merritt Parkway when Scott was 9. His mother had given it to Scott that same year, the year she was still his mother in a residential sense. Before the Tuesday she decided on a different life. He had worn it since, 18 years. The leather band had been replaced twice. The face had a hairline scratch from a dock cleat on a boat he no longer owned. He wore it the way some people wore wedding rings, not as declaration, but as continuity, the physical proof that a chain of days had connected this moment to all the ones before it. He thought about the porch board, the carpenter's quote of $490 for a single warped plank. He thought about a 6-year-old who had offered him a blue blanket with a boat on it because it was too small for her now. Somewhere up the slope in the cottage, a child made a sound in a dream. Not frightened, just the vocal punctuation of deep sleep, the kind children make when their dreaming self registers something that needs brief acknowledgement. And then a quieter sound, a mother's voice, low and automatic, and not quite awake, the kind of sound that doesn't require full consciousness to produce, because the body has learned it and does it on its own. He listened to the silence after that, the particular quality of it. He had spent his adult life in a great many expensive, carefully maintained silences. The silence of good hotels, the silence of conference rooms between decisions, the silence of his own apartment on the 41st floor, where the city noise had been engineered out by glass, so thick it cost more per square foot than most people spent on cars. All of those silences had the same quality. They were the absence of interference. This was different. This was the silence of a place that contained people who were loved. He stood on the dock until 4 in the morning, and then went up the stair and lay back down on the cot and stared at the dormer window until the sky outside it began to lighten from black to the particular dark blue that precedes dawn in northern New Hampshire, where the sky gets serious about the business of morning earlier than it does anywhere south. He slept at 4:40. He dreamed about a porch board. In the morning his phone, which had no signal in the boathouse loft, but which he had plugged into the outlet on the kitchen counter inside the cottage, with Laura's permission, noted in Rule 6 of the agreement, had collected 23 notifications, all of them from Sandra. Sandra Anderson had turned 47 in March and had spent the intervening months doing what she had been doing since she was 15 years old, managing the logistics of her brother's life, with the thoroughness and slight preemptive grief of someone who has learned that if you don't manage things, they fall apart in ways you can't recover from. She had at 17 read Scott Charlotte's Web when he was sick and couldn't sleep, had taken him to the orthodontist 11 times over 3 years, had told him, when he was 12 and still asking, that the question of whether their mother was coming back was not a question worth the energy it cost to ask. He had built his professional life on that sentence. Sandra had started her day at 6 that morning by smoothing the cuff of her left sleeve. Her tell, the one she didn't know she had, the one she did when she was preparing to redirect something, and had decided that her brother's absence from his prearranged summer in Harlan Ridge was a situation that could still be corrected. By 6:15 she had emailed his assistant, by 6:20 the brokerage, by 6:30 the management company for Harlan Lodge. By 6:45 she had her answer. He had not arrived. This was, she thought, already unacceptable. In the cottage kitchen, Laura watched Scott Hill come down the boathouse stair barefoot, in a gray shirt, with his sleeves already rolled, carrying his phone and the look of a man who has not slept enough, but has decided to be functional about it anyway. Coffee's on. Wren's at the dock. I told her you might need to make calls. He looked at his phone. He looked at the lake. He looked at the coffee maker on the counter, steam still rising from it. I should be on calls. And then, quieter, directed more at the phone in his hand than at her. I'm not going to be on calls. Drink the coffee first, Laura said. Otherwise it'll be 24 notifications. He looked at her. She watched him register that she'd been paying attention. Watched him allow himself 1/2 second of being caught by it before he closed the expression back up. All right, he said. He came up the twaps. He took the mug she held through the screen. He stood on her porch in his socks and drank the coffee and did not open the phone. Out on the dock, Wren lay on her stomach on the sun-warmed boards with one hand trailing in the water, naming the fish she couldn't see. She had named 4 of them by the time Laura called her in for toast, and Scott Hill had not in all that time looked at his phone once. It was, he thought later, the first morning of his adult life he had taken coffee without working. He did not know, yet it would also be the morning his sister got on the train. What happened in Harlan Mills when a stranger arrived was this. The village processed him the way a small body of water processes a dropped stone. The ripples were immediate, organized, and moved outward at a predictable rate until they reached every shore. By 10 that morning, 3 separate sources had informed the village that there was an unfamiliar man at Gerald Marsh's old place, Laura Clark's place, who was, depending on the source, either a film producer from Los Angeles, a relative of the Boston family, or someone who had done something inadvisable in the financial sector and needed to be somewhere his lawyers couldn't find him. By 11, Margaret Wilson had made her decision. Margaret was 65 years old and had been the postmistress of Harlan Mills for 22 years, a position that gave her access to more information about more people than most law enforcement agencies had about their jurisdictions. She knew who was behind on their property taxes. She knew which marriages were struggling and which had quietly ended and which had quietly resumed. She knew the rhythms of this village the way a person knows a language they grew up speaking, not as a set of rules but as a felt sense, a deep knowledge of when something sounded right and when it didn't. She closed the post office at 11, walked the half-mile to the lake road carrying a paper bag of peach pastries she had baked that morning, for reasons that now felt, in retrospect, like premonition. Laura, she called through the screen at 11:20, climbing the porch steps with the ease of someone who had been doing it for 6 years. I have brought pastry and a question. The question is what I expected. Margaret let herself in, set the pastries on the kitchen table, took off her cardigan because the kitchen was warm, and looked through the screen door at the dock, where a man she had never seen before was sitting in the slat-back chair Gerald Marsh had built in 1995, reading a sheaf of papers with a yellow highlighter and a mug of coffee balanced on the boards beside him. Wren was 6 feet away, lying on her stomach with her sketchbook, drawing what appeared to be a very serious portrait of a bird. Man on your dock, Margaret observed. Yellow highlighter. Saturday morning? Wednesday? Laura said. Saturday or Wednesday there's a man on your dock, Laura told her. 15 sentences, brisk and complete. The brokerage error, the delayed keys at Harlan Lodge. The agreement, the signed rules on the yellow legal pad, the rate. She did not editorialize. She stated facts in the order they had occurred, the way you give a deposition, Margaret would say later, and not the way you tell a story to someone you trust, which told her at least as much as the facts themselves. Margaret took half a pastry from the bag, crossed to the porch screen and raised her voice to carry to the dock. Scott Hill. Margaret Wilson, postmistress. I have a pastry and it belongs to you if you'll come up here and tell me in plain language what you're doing on the dock of a woman who has been minding her own business in this village for 6 years. Down on the dock, Scott Hill set the highlighter across the papers, stewed, capped the pen, walked the length of the dock and across the lawn and up the porch steps with the expression of a man who has not been spoken to that way in quite some time and has discovered to his own slight surprise that he is not insulted. He took the pastry. He thanked her. He explained in 7 sentences exactly what Laura had explained in 15. He added 1 sentence Laura had not added, said without being asked, without performance. I understand my presence here is irregular, and if it causes any discomfort to any of the neighbors, I'll move to the inn in the village this afternoon. Margaret ate her half of the pastry. It causes me discomfort, she said, in a very particular way. The way it causes me discomfort is this. Why has a man with a car like that and a watch like that chosen to spend his Wednesday morning on a dock in Harlan Mills reading papers when he could be in a hotel in Concord with room service and reliable Wi-Fi? He looked at the lake. 'Cause the dock is quiet and the office isn't. Margaret finished the pastry, brushed the sugar from her thumb. Then you may stay. But Scott Hill, if you come into the post office in the next 2 weeks, I require that you know the name of every person in this village within 3 days. That you learn which dog belongs to which house. That you nod at the Hensleys even though they won't nod back, because of a matter involving a property line and a cherry tree in 1997, that I'm not going to explain because you don't need the explanation, you just need to nod. Harlan Mills is a working village. We don't have summer people, we have neighbors. Understood, Scott said, and bring your sister. If she's the kind of sister who sends 23 notifications before 8 in the morning, she needs a peach pastry shoe. She retrieved her cardigan. Nodded once at Laura. Pillowcases are folded wrong, dear. Corners go to the inside, I know. I'm distracted, I noticed, and then turning back to the screen. Scott Hill, one more thing. If you teach that child anything this summer, teach her how to bait a hook without flinching. Her mother flinches. It's the only thing her mother does badly. She let herself out, past Timothy Clark at the bottom of the lane, who had come out of the hardware store to see what the unfamiliar SUV was about. Don't go up, Margaret said without breaking stride. He's fine. He's also paying her, which she needs. Timothy went back inside. Margaret walked back toward the village with the empty pastry bag and a version of the situation that was now, in her assessment, adequately understood. Up at the cottage, Laura stood on the porch and watched Margaret go. Scott stood beside her, not close, a proper distance, the distance of someone who understood that proximity was a thing you earned, holding his half of the pastry he hadn't finished eating. That was efficient, he said. That was Harlan Mills. Will there be more of that today? There will be more of it until Thursday, at which point the village will have what it needs and will move on to the Methodist potluck, which is the third Sunday of the month. Should I move to the inn? She thought about it. She thought about the porch board and the soup she hadn't meant to cook for two, and the word permit, and the way he'd listened to Wren explain the difference between species of herons without once treating it as a performance she was supposed to find charming. No, she said. Margaret is the test. If she's decided you can stay, you can stay. Wren likes you. I have a porch board to fix, and I am not in the business of turning down good rates because a man named Hill once owned a hotel I'll never sleep in. That's a yes. That's a yes. He went back down to the dock, picked up the highlighter, sat down in the slat-back chair, and Wren, who had been watching the exchange from the far end of the dock, with the air of someone who had been waiting for the official verdict, crawled over with her sketchbook and held up the drawing she'd been working on. A heron, 6 lines, a serious eye, rendered in the confident, slightly wrong way that 6-year-old drawings are rendered, where the proportions are off but the essential truth of the thing is somehow right. Is this a great blue or a green? He looked at it. Took longer than the question technically required. It has the legs of a great blue, he said, and the eye of a green. So it's neither. It's its own kind. A wren heron, she nodded once, satisfied. Turned back to the sketchbook. Laura was still on the porch, holding the folded pillowcases against her chest. She had watched him look at that drawing, watched the deliberateness of the consideration he gave it. A 6-year-old's drawing of a bird, and he had looked at it the way you look at something that deserved to be looked at. She turned and went back into the cottage before he could see her face. He drove into the village at 2:30. Wren was napping. She still napped some afternoons, though she would have contested the characterization if confronted with it. And the cottage was quiet in the way it was quiet on slow weekday afternoons in June, before the heat of July, before the families arrived with their noise and their needs and their relentless cheerfulness. Laura unfolded the legal pad. Read the rules she'd written, 8 items. Specific and protective and, reading them now, slightly more defensive in their tone than she remembered them being when she wrote them. Like reading something she'd written in a different mood. She refolded the pad and put it in the kitchen drawer. He came back at 3:45. The SUV appeared at the bottom of the lane and she watched it come up slowly, and watched him get out and open the back door, and watched him lift from the back seat a cedar plank. 8 feet, 8 inches, rough cut. He carried it under one arm, with a brown paper bag from Timothy Clark's hardware store in his other hand. He set the plank on the porch beside the warped board, set the bag next to it. Took out a tape measure. Laura came to the screen door. He looked up. The carpenter quoted you $4.90, he said, without preamble, without the performance of explaining himself. The plank, screws, and carriage bolts came to $43. That's not. And I'm evidently not on a call, and the lake is loud at night. That's not a reason. It's part of one. She waited. He measured the warped board, measured the new plank, marked the cut line in pencil, pressing the side of the pencil flat against the edge of the existing board. The way someone who has done this before does it. Not the way someone who has watched a video about how to do it does it. My grandfather, he said, still looking at the board, had a boat. Not a rowboat, a real one. Wooden sloop 30 feet, he kept it on the Sound. He taught me to maintain the decking when I was 9. The summer after my mother left, he told me that a man who couldn't fix what he stood on didn't deserve to stand there. A pause. I haven't used a screwdriver in 18 years. I want to find out if I still know how. Your porch board is the opportunity. There was no performance in it. No bid for her sympathy or her admiration. Just the statement of a thing, offered plainly. Laura stood at the screen door with the dish towel in her hand, and the front of her shirt slightly damp from where she'd been doing dishes, and did not move. After a moment she said, "Ren." Ren appeared from the hallway where she had, evidently, not been napping for some time and had been listening from a position of strategic concealment. "Can I hand him the screws?" "One at a time. You stay on the porch rug. You do not step onto the floorboards until he says it's safe." Ren carried the small open box of deck screws out through the screen door and set them on the rug at the threshold, and sat cross-legged beside the box with the focused readiness of someone who has been assigned a role and intends to execute it properly. Scott Hill, CEO of Hill Hospitality. Operations across 11 states, took a single galvanized 2.5-inch deck screw from the open palm of a 6-year-old and did not in the next 90 minutes look at his phone once. By 3 o'clock, Laura had brought out 2 glasses of lemonade, powdered from the canister in the back of the pantry. The warped board was up. The new plank was halfway in. Scott had pencil marks on his temple where he'd pushed his hair back with the back of his wrist. Ren had a deck screw behind her left ear that she had placed there herself as some kind of organizational system. The porch smelled of fresh cedar and warm pine pitch and cut wood heating in the afternoon sun. "I have lemonade," Laura said. "Not the kind from the city," she added. An offering of information she hadn't planned to offer. The kind that slips out when you're trying to say something smaller than what you actually mean. "I love the kind from the canister," he said. It was not exactly true. She could tell by the quarter-second delay before he said it, the way a genuine preference lands differently than a decision to be gracious. But it was the kind of not exactly true that wasn't a lie. It was the kind that meant I am willing to be here, in this the way it is, and mean it. She noted it. She handed him the lemonade through the screen. By 5 o'clock the new board was in. By 6, Ren had drawn a small formal portrait of it in her sketchbook and labeled it the rich man's board in careful lowercase letters. By 7, Scott had gone back to the boathouse with a copy of the acquisition memorandum under one arm. At 7:12 his phone on the cottage counter lit up for the 24th time with a message from his sister. "Scott, where are you? I'm on the train." He saw it at 9. He stood at the boathouse window and looked down at the cottage lit yellow below him. He thought about Sandra on a train heading north, and he thought about Sandra meeting Laura Clark, and he thought about those two things in proximity to each other. He typed back, "I'm at the lake. I'll be reachable Sunday. Don't come up." The response was immediate. "I'm already on the train." He closed the phone, turned off the lamp, lay down on the cot in the loft above the boat slip and listened to the lake. He thought about the porch board, fitted now into its proper place. The cedar still pale against the weathered gray of the surrounding planks. How it would look in 3 weeks, a month, a whole season. How it would darken and weather and eventually match. And how in a year you would not be able to tell which board had been replaced, only that someone had cared enough to replace it. He pressed the watch harder. Then he slept, finally. The way you sleep when something you didn't know was wrong has been, if not fixed, at least begun. Sunday arrived the way good Sundays do in northern New Hampshire. Quiet first, then bird song, then the smell of something cooking that made the whole morning reorganize itself around it. Laura made pancakes every Sunday, had made them every Sunday for 6 years. The recipe was her grandmother's. Buttermilk, a single grating of nutmeg, the cast iron preheated slow, the wrist movement on the flip that you couldn't teach exactly, only demonstrate and let the other person learn by watching. She made them because Ren expected them. Because Sunday without pancakes was not Sunday. Because the routine of them, measuring the buttermilk, grating the nutmeg, waiting for the surface bubbles that meant turn now, was one of the few things in her week that asked nothing of her except attention. She was not making them for a man in the boathouse. She was very clear about that, except the batter was larger than usual, which could have been an accident, which she chose not to examine. 8:10 in the morning. The screen door was propped open with the iron doorstop shaped like a sitting dog that had belonged to Gerald Marsh, and that she had kept because Wren named it Howard on day one, and you can't unname a doorstop. The air coming through carried the last of the night's cool, and the lake was doing the thing it did on still mornings when the mist sat on the surface and the whole world 40 feet out, dissolved into gray and white, and you couldn't tell where the water ended and the sky began. She heard him before she saw him. The boathouse stair made a specific sound. 4 boards that creaked in sequence, low, high, low, creak, a pattern so consistent she'd stopped hearing it as 4 separate sounds and had started hearing it as a single word the house said whenever he came down. She heard that word now, then his footsteps on the gravel, then silence where the footsteps stopped. She didn't turn around, but she heard him say it. Under his breath, directed at no one, just the morning and the smell and whatever the word meant to him in that particular moment. Pancakes. Not like a man identifying breakfast. Like a man saying the name of a place he thought he'd never get back to. He crossed the yard. He came to the bottom of the porch steps and stopped. Did not come up, did not push the screen open. She turned from the stove and held the mug through the screen without being asked, without ceremony. The way you hand something to someone you've already established a vocabulary with, even if that vocabulary is 2 days old and made entirely of small, careful gestures. He took it. He said thank you, and drank it standing in the yard and did not move toward the steps. The restraint of someone who understood that the steps were not his to take without invitation. Who had understood that from the beginning, actually, and had not needed to be told. You can come up, she said after a moment. There's a pancake, there's only one extra. Wren requires honesty about the quantity. From the table, where she was already eating and had been watching this entire exchange, with the transparent focus of a child who knows something important is happening and is trying not to jinx it. There's only one. But you can have it. You fixed the porch board. That's generous, Scott said. To Wren directly, the way he always addressed her directly, which Laura had stopped noting consciously because it happened every time, and she was trying to stop cataloging the things he did that she hadn't expected. He came up the steps. He came into the kitchen, which he had not been in before, the outdoor shower, the porch, the dock, but never the kitchen, and he stopped at the threshold the way a person stops when they enter a room that belongs to someone else in a way that is more than just legal. The kitchen was small. The wall behind the stove was still the original 1962 yellow, the color of old butter, slightly uneven where someone had painted around the light switch instead of removing it. The table was set for 2, and there was a third place she had quietly added when she heard the boathouse stair. He saw it. Didn't say anything about it. She slid the pancake onto his plate, pushed the butter across, set down the jar of maple syrup with the handwritten label, Wilson's Maple, Harlan Mills, 2026, that Margaret had pressed on her in April, and that she'd been rationing because it was the last of the previous season's batch. He poured the syrup, cut the pancake, put the first piece in his mouth, and closed his eyes. It was involuntary. She could tell because he didn't perform it. There was no slight lean back, no appreciative sound, none of the theater of enjoyment. He simply closed his eyes for 3 seconds and then opened them again, and in those 3 seconds, something in his face that had been held very carefully in a particular position had let go. Laura turned back to the stove. She flipped the pancake she was cooking for herself, which was already done and didn't need flipping, and looked at the wall above the burner and thought about nothing in particular with great concentration until she was sure her face was behaving. Wren, who had eaten half her pancake and abandoned the rest in favor of watching him, announced, "He likes it, I can see that," Laura said. "He really likes it, Wren, I'm just saying, I know what you're saying." "Eat your pancake," Wren ate 1 bite. Then, "Mama makes them every Sunday." "That," Scott said, his voice slightly different than it had been 30 seconds ago. Slower, a degree warmer, the old money clip there, but something else underneath it now, like a frequency you feel before you hear. Seems like a very sensible tradition. He ate 2 more pancakes. He drank a second cup of coffee and listened while Wren explained the complete social structure of the heron population on Harlan Lake. Henry was the dominant bird. Henry was, in Wren's assessment, not a good person, but he was the biggest, and he had Patricia and the smaller bird, the one without a name, the one that had arrived alone 3 weeks ago, and had been trying to find a place to stand ever since, was still being pushed off the near buoy every morning by Henry, who didn't need the near buoy and simply didn't want anyone else to have it. "That's not very fair," Scott said. "No. But Henry's been here the longest, and Patricia is his wife, and the small bird doesn't have anyone on this lake. And then, with the particular precision that Wren brought to sentences that meant more than they said. So the small bird stays near the dock he thinks is his, and Henry comes over anyway, and the small bird has to move every single time. Scott did not look at Laura. Laura did not look at Scott. The cast iron pan hissed on the burner, between the silence and the next thing. Outside, on the gravel road, a car, coming fast, not the brokerage's car, a silver sedan with Manhattan plates that stopped at the bottom of the lane, because the lane was too narrow, and because the driver had decided, or had always known, that she was not the kind of person who let narrow lanes stop her, only slowed her. Sandra Anderson. She was 47 years old, and she wore it the way women who have been managing things since 15 wear 47. Not young, not old, simply competent in a way that had outlasted the age it started at. Navy linen jacket, uncreased, which meant she had stood for the train, rather than sat because, sitting creased linen, and she had known she was going to walk into a situation, and she wanted her first impression to be exactly what she intended. White trousers that had creased, low leather flats that were new, the soles still unscuffed, which meant she had bought them specifically for this trip, which meant she had thought about how she wanted to appear, which meant she had expected opposition and had dressed for the version of the conversation where she won. She came up the gravel without breaking stride. Scott saw her through the kitchen window. Set his fork down, Laura. I owe you an apology in advance. He didn't raise his voice. My sister has just arrived. She's going to be polite. She's going to be efficient. And she is going to be, frankly, a lot. I'll get her off your property as fast as I can. Laura wiped her hands on the apron, turned to Wren. Eat your pancake. Stay at the table. If someone asks you a question, you can answer it, but you don't have to. Okay. Wren took a bite. Did not take her eyes off the window. The screen door opened. Sandra Anderson did not knock. She walked into the kitchen of a woman she had never met, with the ease of someone who has spent so long in rooms that others arranged for her that she had stopped distinguishing between invitation and access. She set her bag on the floor. She looked at her brother sitting at a small kitchen table in front of a half-eaten pancake with maple syrup on the cuff of his sweater, and she did the smallest thing with her mouth that wasn't quite anything. Scott, frankly, this is more than I expected. He named the room for her. Laura Clark. Her daughter Wren, pancakes. He offered a chair. Sandra could see, she informed him, that there were pancakes. She would not sit. She would have coffee if Miss Clark was willing. Laura poured a cup. Set it at the far end of the counter where Sandra could reach it without coming further into the room. Thank you, Sandra said. And then, looking past Laura and past the coffee and past everything in the kitchen, that was not the thing she had come to say. Scott, I have spent 11 hours confirming through 3 separate firms that you are in the wrong county, in the wrong house with the wrong arrangement. I have a car, a driver, and a suite at the Renaissance in Concord already held. In Harlan Ridge, the lodge you intended. I have the keys. I retrieved them this morning at 5 via courier. The Mastern Council needs you visible by Wednesday. I am here to drive you to Harlan Ridge this afternoon. She said all of this the way you read a verdict. No pause for response. No gap where disagreement could enter. The whole thing delivered as a thing already decided. Scott didn't move, Sandra. I appreciate the effort. Just that. Level. I'm not going to Harlan Ridge. Sandra smoothed the cuff of her left sleeve. There it was. Laura had seen that gesture yesterday on the dock and had filed it without knowing why. Now she understood the tell. The micro-movement of a person preparing to redirect, to deploy the next argument in the sequence, to not lose. Frankly, Sandra said, you are, frankly. I'm not. He held her gaze across the table, across the kitchen, across whatever the 20 years of their specific history had made of the distance between them. I have an arrangement with Laura that runs through the 20th. After the 20th, I'll reassess. I'll keep my weekly call with the Mastern Council. I'll read the memorandum. I'll sign what needs signing. I'll do all of it from Harlan Mills. And then, steadily. The lodge in Harlan Ridge is yours for the summer if you want it. I won't be there. The kitchen went very quiet. Wren had stopped eating. Her fork was on the edge of her plate. She was watching Sandra with the same serious, unblinking attention she had watched Scott with 2 days ago from the porch railing. The attention of a child taking the full measure of something. Sandra looked at her brother, then at Laura, then at Wren, and then not back at Scott, which was the thing Laura noticed. She looked at the child last, and did not look away as quickly as she should have. And something in her face did something that wasn't calculable, something that arrived from somewhere below the level of strategy. Miss Clark. Sandra's voice was perfectly correct. "Would you mind if I borrowed my brother for 10 minutes? We'll walk to the end of the dock. We'll be visible from your kitchen window the entire time." "He's not my brother," Laura said. "But of course," Scott stood, put his hand briefly on the back of his chair, looked at Ren. "Save me the last bupt." "Okay," Ren said. He followed Sandra out of the kitchen. They walked the length of the dock. They stood at the end of it, side by side, their backs to the cottage. Two tall people in city clothes against the pale, worn wood and the silver morning water. They spoke for 14 minutes. Laura didn't try to hear them. She stood at the kitchen window and watched structure instead of content. She watched Sandra's shoulders, which started high and controlled, and gradually, over the first 8 minutes, made the small incremental descent of a person losing ground they didn't know they were losing. She watched Scott's hand find the watch once, press the band, release. She watched the moment, around the 11th minute, when Sandra stopped talking entirely and looked out at the lake with her profile to the cottage, for almost a full minute without speaking. What happened next was small, precise, the kind of thing you miss if you're watching for something larger. Sandra reached into the inside pocket of her jacket, took out something small, too small to identify from 30 yards, just a shape in her closed fist. She held it at her side without showing her brother, and her shoulders went down a degree more. Not a defeat exactly. Something quieter than defeat. The way a body looks when a person has been holding a private argument with themselves for a very long time and has just, in some interior space, conceded it. She looked at her hand. She put the small thing back. She turned and said something to Scott that lasted less than 10 seconds. Then she walked up the dock alone. She didn't come back into the kitchen. She picked up her bag from the porch where she'd set it on the way through. She walked down to the silver sedan. She got in. The car backed slowly down the lane and was gone. Scott stayed at the end of the dock for a long time. Long enough that Ren finished the last bite of her pancake, and then, after a period of deliberation, wrapped one more bite in a napkin and set it on the edge of the table to wait. When Scott came back into the kitchen, his face was the careful blank of a man who has been handed something he wasn't expecting from someone who didn't intend to give it and doesn't know yet what to do with it. "Where's the last bite?" "Right here." Ren held up the napkin. He sat down, took the bite, chewed it slowly. Not a performance of anything, but simply the evidence that he was doing the thing slowly, because fast wasn't available to him right now. Laura said his name and asked if Sandra was gone. "She's gone. Will she come back?" He looked at the lake through the kitchen window, eventually. But not today. He didn't tell Laura then what he'd seen Sandra take out of her jacket. He'd seen it for half a second when her hand opened slightly before she closed it again. The white border of an old photograph. A Polaroid. He'd been too far away to see the image. He didn't need to. He had one in his own wallet, had carried it since he was 9 years old. In 20 years it had never once occurred to him that Sandra might be carrying one too. And now it had occurred to him, the way certain things occur to you, not as new information, but as information that was always there, and you simply hadn't turned it over to look at the other side. He ate the rest of the pancake. He thanked Laura. He went back to the boathouse to read the acquisition memorandum and did not work for the rest of the day. The week that followed had a rhythm Laura hadn't lived inside before. Not the rhythm of routine, which was regular and self-sustaining, and asked nothing new of you. This was different. The rhythm of a space that had added a variable and was in the process of recalibrating around it. Scott read in the mornings on the dock. Not performatively, just actually there, in the slat-back chair, yellow highlighter in hand, papers spread on the boards beside the coffee mug. He walked the gravel lane at noon for his calls, far enough that the signal was better and the conversation didn't carry. He ate in the village. He came back in the evenings. He helped Ren look for frogs in the cattail shallows. Did not pick her up or touch her shoulder. Used the yellow highlighter as a pointing stick, angling it toward the bank where the water went dark and still. By Wednesday, Ren had named 3 frogs, 2 Roberts and 1 Charles, because she had a system for naming things she wasn't sure about, and the system involved defaulting to a name she found reliable. By Thursday, Scott had memorized which Robert was which Ren acknowledged with a single nod of the kind she reserved for things that had been done correctly. He drove into the village every afternoon. He nodded at the Hensleys. The Hensleys did not nod back, on principle. He bought a fishing license at the general store and spent 3 different mornings on the dock with the rod from the flat case and did not catch a single fish, which he also accepted without complaint. He reported this to Ren, Each time he came up from the dock, empty-handed, and Ren each time offered a theory about what he was doing wrong. And he listened to each theory with the kind of attention you give to a person who might be right. He was not doing this to be liked. That was the thing Laura kept noticing, and then immediately trying to stop noticing. He wasn't performing. He wasn't running a campaign. He was simply in the village, in the cottage yard, on the dock, in the places he was supposed to be, doing what each place called for. And the doing of it was quiet and consistent in a way that was harder to dismiss than a grand gesture would have been. On Tuesday afternoon, he sat at her kitchen table. He had knocked first, had waited until she said yes, had sat in the chair she indicated, not any chair he chose, and had opened the black binder and said, very politely, that he had a question about 3 paragraphs if she had a moment. She had a moment. She said so before she thought about it. He turned the binder so she could read. The 3 paragraphs were the operative language of a non-compete clause in a business acquisition memorandum. Dry, dense, the kind of prose designed to be technically precise while remaining practically opaque, which was a skill that required genuine effort and a particular kind of contempt for the reader. She read it once through for sense. Read it again more slowly. She set her index finger on a line in the middle of the 2nd paragraph. The exclusion for pre-existing brand operations within a 40-mile radius of any controlled property. What does controlled mean here? He looked at her. Because if the acquiring party holds even a minority interest in any commercial property within Midtown Manhattan, he could argue that the 40-mile radius covers the entire borough, which would make the clause unenforceable as written. You'd need to define controlled the way the SEC defines beneficial ownership, or you have a clause that sounds protective and does nothing. Silence. Not an empty silence. The silence of someone processing information that has arrived from an unexpected direction. He took out the fountain pen, wrote in the margin, small, careful, the handwriting of a man who had learned cursive properly and had kept it. Capped the pen, closed the binder. Where did you learn to read a non-compete clause? 3 years of architecture school before I had Ren. Architects read contracts. Mostly bad ones, Laura. He said her name as a full stop. That is the 3rd thing my legal team was supposed to find before they sent me this memorandum. They have been billing me at $1,400 an hour for 9 months. They did not find it. She looked at him. So I'm apparently $1,400 an hour, she said. And Scott Hill laughed. Not the careful exhale she'd heard on Sunday. This was an actual laugh. Short, surprised, real. The kind of laugh a person produces when something catches them exactly where they didn't know they were open to being caught. It lasted 2 seconds, lifted at the end. And then it was over and he was composed again. But something had shifted in the quality of the composition. The way a room is different after a window has been opened even after you close it again. At the far end of the kitchen, Ren set down her crayon. She looked at her mother. Mama, a whisper. He laughed. I know, Laura whispered back. Don't make it a thing, okay? Ren whispered. Ren immediately made it a thing by going to her sketchbook and drawing 3 quick lines that were supposed to be his face. Recognizable in the way her drawings were always recognizable. More true than accurate, with a small curve at the corner of the mouth. She labeled it the rich man laughing in lowercase. She did not show it to him. She put it in the back of the sketchbook, where she kept the drawings she considered documentary. That evening Scott called his legal team from the bend in the lane. He spoke for 11 minutes. He spoke quietly and without raising his voice, which was, Laura understood now, how he spoke when he was most serious. The team opened the call, apologizing for missing the clause. He ended the call with a list of things they had missed over the preceding 14 months, delivered in the same quiet voice, without theater. He came back to the cottage, stood at the bottom of the porch steps. Laura, I'd like to pay you $1,200. For what? For 4 minutes of legal analysis that my team failed to provide in 9 months. No, she said. Why not? Because then I become someone you pay to think for you. And I've spent 6 years building a life where no one pays me to think for anyone, including myself. Including the man whose name I don't say in this house. I'm not going back into that arrangement, because you have a bad clause. He absorbed this. Didn't argue with it. Didn't qualify it. Then I'll buy you a porch board, he said. You already bought me a porch board. I'll buy you a second porch board. There must be another one. She looked at the porch. The board adjacent to the one he'd replaced, second from the step, was already showing the early signs of the same failure. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. The one next to the one you replaced, she said. It'll go by August. Then I'll buy that one. All right, all right. The deal was struck with no paperwork and no ceremony and no money changing hands, which was, she thought, closing the screen door behind her, exactly the right shape for it. On Thursday, Wren named the small heron Albert. She did it without announcement, without ceremony, simply looked up from the dock in the late afternoon, with the sketchbook in her lap, and said his name the way you say the name of someone you've already decided is real, Albert. The small bird on the near buoy, the one Henry kept displacing, the one that had arrived alone and had been trying to find a place to stand ever since. Scott heard it from the slat-back chair. He set down the highlighter and looked at the near buoy where Albert sat, compact and slightly ruffled, in the specific posture of a bird that has decided to stand its ground on a piece of real estate it is not entirely sure it has the right to occupy. Albert's a good name, he said. I know. Wren considered the drawing. He needed a name before Henry could take the buoy again. You can't displace something that has a name. The sentence landed in the afternoon air and sat there. Scott looked at the bird named Albert. He looked at the sketchbook. He looked at Wren with the expression of a person who has just heard a 6-year-old say something that is going to take him several days to fully unpack. No, he said. I suppose you can't. On Wednesday it rained. Not the forecast rain, which had been a vague possibility for Thursday. This was the other kind. The kind that arrives unannounced in the night and is still arriving in the morning and shows no sign of having any interest in the clearing it theoretically planned. Local radio at 6 had said mostly sunny. By 1 o'clock the rain was horizontal against the dormer window of the boathouse loft, and the power had gone out across the entire north shore of Harlan Lake, and the temperature in the cottage was 66 degrees and dropping. The boathouse was worse. No insulation, no propane. The kerosene heater she'd mentioned to Scott worked, but it was a loft heater for a loft designed to store equipment, not a loft where a person was supposed to sleep through a June night that had decided to behave like October. Scott came down the boathouse stair at 2:20 with a battery-powered lantern he had bought at Timothy Clark's hardware store on Tuesday, for reasons he had not been able to fully explain to himself at the time, and stood in the yard in the rain. The cottage lights were out. The cottage was dark. He looked up at it. Laura, not loud. Loud enough, she came to the screen. The boathouse loft has a kerosene heater. The previous owner left it. I tested it Monday. It works. There's a full sealed can in the corner. He stood in the rain and delivered this information with the steady practicality of someone who has already worked out the logistics and is presenting a solution, not a negotiation. The loft is dry. The cot is narrow, but it's not cold. If you and Wren would rather not be cold tonight, I can sleep on the dock under a tarp. She looked at him. Standing in the rain in his good jacket that was absolutely the wrong jacket for rain, the watch getting wet on his wrist, the yard between them the color of pewter. Scott, very flat, it's a good tarp. You are not sleeping on the dock under a tarp, it's waterproof. You're not sleeping under a tarp. She opened the screen. The cottage has a sofa. The sofa has a wool blanket. The propane will last through tomorrow if I cook one meal. Wren and I will sleep in my room. You sleep on the sofa. The kerosene heater and stays in the boathouse in case the propane runs out overnight. Are you sure? There is a child in this house and the temperature is dropping. Yes, I'm sure. Come in. He came up onto the porch, left his shoes outside. She hadn't asked him to, he just did it, and came into the kitchen in his socks, stood with his hands at his sides in the posture of someone who has just been told they are a guest and is taking the designation literally. She gave him a towel. She gave him the gray wool sweater from the cedar chest in the parlor. It had been her Uncle Roy's, the last of the things she'd kept when she cleared his house 2 years ago, soft from decades of being washed the right way, large enough to fit a man who had Roy's broad shoulders, which Scott almost exactly did. She gave him a mug of tea. She got the wood stove going in the parlor with cedar kindling from the box by the door, and fed it the oak log she'd been saving for October because October was a long way away and tonight was cold now. The kitchen warmed. The parlor warmed. The rain kept coming. Wren was in bed by 8:30. 3 blankets, the quilt, and the stuffed heron she called Patricia. She fell asleep while Laura was still in the room, which was unusual. Wren was a difficult sleeper on normal nights, her mind staying busy well, past the point where her body had given up. Tonight she was asleep before the story was done. The cold and the sound of rain and the fact that things were different had done what ordinary tiredness never quite managed. Laura came back into the parlor. Scott was on the sofa, sitting up, not lying down, the wool blanket around his shoulders, the binder open in his lap and the battery lantern on the side table casting its warm yellow. He looked up when she came in. How is she? Asleep. She likes storms. Laura sat in the armchair across the sofa, tucked her feet up under her. The fire in the wood stove had settled into its working rhythm, the orange flicker showing through the grate. She's decided this is the best storm of her life because there's a man in the parlor with a lantern. Then I'm earning my keep. You're earning your keep. The rain hit the windows in irregular intervals, the sound of it changing when the wind shifted. Somewhere outside, a branch was knocking against the boathouse wall, a slow, irregular knock that Laura had stopped hearing in the way you stop hearing things that aren't going to stop. Scott, yes, why are you really here? Not an accusation. Not even quite a question. The thing you say when you've been turning a question over long enough that asking it directly is the only thing left. I don't mean the brokerage error. I don't mean the lake. I mean why you specifically needed 10 weeks away from a city you've spent your entire adult life building a life inside of. He set the binder on the cushion beside him, pressed his thumb against the watchband, looked at the fire. Because my sister told me not to come, he said. That's not. I know it's not the real answer. He looked at the fire for another moment. The real answer is that I haven't in 11 years been alone in a room with my own thoughts. The apartment in Manhattan isn't a room, it's a corridor between meetings. And Sandra had decided that me being alone with my thoughts in any location accessible to the Mastern Council was a problem she needed to solve before I could solve it myself. So she chose Harlan Ridge. The booking system chose Harlan Mills. And the lake, he stopped. Started again. The lake chose your porch. I don't generally believe lakes choose things. But this lake I'm willing to make an exception for. It was, Laura said, almost a sentimental sentence. He was aware, he said. He'd prefer she not mention it to anyone. She wouldn't, she said. The fire settled. The branch knocked. The rain ticked against the windows like something trying to remember how to count. And then Laura said the thing she hadn't planned to say. The thing that was there before she had decided to let it out. The way some sentences are already formed and waiting. And you find out, you've said them, at the same time the other person does. I haven't been alone in a room with a man at night since 2019. Since Ren's father left mine, she kept her voice level. This was not a revelation she was performing. It was information she was providing because it was relevant, and because she had decided, in the 3 seconds between thinking it and saying it, that not saying it was a kind of small dishonesty that would cost more than saying it. I'm not telling you that to make you uncomfortable. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I'm not going to be able to be ordinary about the fact that you're on my sofa tonight, and I'm asking you in advance. If I'm awkward about it tomorrow, please pretend you didn't notice. He did not move. He did not look directly at her. He held the stillness of someone who understood that the correct response to certain kinds of honesty was to receive it without flinching and without performing a feeling about it. Understood, he said. She thanked him. Then, after a pause that had the weight of something being decided on both sides simultaneously. For what it's worth, I haven't slept on a sofa since I was 11. I'm not going to be ordinary about it either. I'll pretend tomorrow that I slept the way I always sleep. That should cover us both. She laughed. Not the kind of laugh you produce because something is funny in a safe way. The kind that surprises you out of your own defenses. Small and sudden and involuntary, and she pressed her hand against her mouth a half-second too late to stop it. It slid through the room like a stone. Skipped twice on the surface of the quiet and left rings. He did the thing with his mouth. The place a smile would have been. Good night, Scott. Good night, Laura. She stood. She left the parlor. She closed her bedroom door behind her and climbed into bed beside Ren without turning on the light. She lay on her back and listened to the rain on the roof. And underneath the rain, below it, a sound she told herself she wasn't listening for. The sound of the sofa in the parlor taking a man's weight as he lay down. And then the particular silence of someone on the other side of a wall, not quite asleep, not quite awake, occupying a house with you. She stared at the ceiling. She did not sleep until after 3. The power came back at 6. By 9 the cottage smelled of coffee and cedar smoke and the faint particular warmth of wet wood beginning to dry. Ren was on the porch counting the puddles in the lane, maintaining a precise record in a water-warped notebook she called the puddle registry. The sky was the clean, washed blue that only arrives after an unforecast storm, the blue that seems to be apologizing. Laura made pancakes for 3. She made them for 3 because Ren would want them, and she was hungry, and there was a man in the parlor who had slept on her sofa, and she was not going to be strange about that. She was going to be practical. She was going to make the batter for 3, and that was a domestic decision and not a declaration. Scott appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd folded the blanket, set it on the arm of the sofa. He was in yesterday's clothes, but the clothes were straightened, the sweater folded at the cuffs, the hair combed. The watch was on his wrist and the face of it was dry, which meant he'd dried it sometime in the night. He carried his shoes in one hand. He looked at the pancakes. He looked at the three-set table with the Wilson's maple syrup already out. He had an expression that Laura, standing at the stove, did not directly see because she had her back to him, but which Wren, coming in from the porch, saw completely and subsequently recorded in the puddle registry alongside the morning's precipitation data. He sat at the table. He ate the pancake she set before him. He poured the syrup and cut the first piece and let himself have it. Differently than the Sunday before, less involuntary, more like recognition. Like a man who has stopped being surprised that a thing is good and has started simply receiving it. He does it every time, Wren told Laura, not quietly. Wren, I'm just noting it for the record. You can note it quietly. Wren noted it quietly in the puddle registry. On Tuesday afternoon of the second week, he sat across from her at the kitchen table, with the acquisition binder again. Different section this time. A representations and warranties clause that was longer than it needed to be and structured in a way that obscured, rather than clarified the thing it was supposed to be doing. She read it the way she'd learned to read bad legal language. Looking for what wasn't there rather than what was. Finding the shape of the absence, the outlines of the thing the clause was avoiding saying directly. She found it in the third paragraph. An indemnification rider buried in a subordinate clause, written in the kind of legalistic subordination, designed to make you think you'd read the important part before you'd reached it. She put her finger on it. If this activates at any point in the first 3 years post-acquisition, she explained, he was looking at somewhere between $9 and $12 million in liability over 6 years, an indemnification obligation that his team had apparently read as standard boilerplate and passed over. Scott looked at the clause. He looked at her finger on the page. My team, he said, very quietly, has been billing me at $1,400 an hour for 9 months. I know. They did not find this. No. He sat back in the chair. He looked at the ceiling for 3 seconds. Then back down at the binder. Then out the kitchen window at the lake, which was doing nothing in particular, the way lakes do nothing in particular when the humans on shore are having the realizations that require it. Laura. His voice had a different quality now. Not the old money clip. Not even the warmer version of it she'd started hearing in the past week. Something underneath both of those, the voice a person has when they're talking from below the level of the role they normally play. This changes things, the acquisition, the last 9 months, the shape of what I've been doing. If this is the third thing my team missed, he stopped. I've been working from a set of assumptions about the people around me that may not be accurate. She waited. I have built, he said, with the careful precision of someone choosing words for accuracy rather than effect, a significant amount of infrastructure on the premise that the people I pay to be excellent are in fact excellent. And I have confused paying them with knowing them, which is a mistake. I apparently needed a lake and a bad booking and a porch board to be in a position to see. Wren was at the end of the table with her coloring book, not coloring, listening the way she always listened to things she had decided were important, with her whole body still, and her face pointed just slightly away from the conversation, as if not looking directly at it would let her hear it better. Laura said the thing that was the right thing to say, and also, she thought, the true thing. The people we pay to be excellent are usually excellent at the thing we hired them for. They're just not always excellent at the thing we actually needed. He looked at her for a long moment. That's the problem exactly, he said. Sandra came back on a Friday in the second week of July. She did not arrive at the cottage. She arrived at the village. She arrived at the post office at 10 o'clock in the morning in the same navy linen jacket and low leather flats. Soles scuffed now, Laura would notice later, which meant she had been somewhere and done something with her feet on the ground since the morning of the pancakes. She carried a single brown envelope. No calfskin bag. Margaret looked up from sorting Tuesday's catalogs. Sandra Anderson. I've been told to expect you. By whom? Postmistress's instinct. You're the only navy linen jacket in the village. We're not a navy linen jacket village, frankly, Sandra said. I require a peach pastry. Frankly, I'm out of peach. I have apple. Apple is acceptable. Margaret fetched the apple pastry, set it on the counter, did not ring it up, crossed her arms, asked what was in the envelope. When Sandra said she might not, Margaret informed her there would be no apple pastry. Sandra looked at her. Sandra smoothed the cuff of her left sleeve. Then slowly, with the kind of resignation that was almost not a resignation, the way a person closes the lid of a box she had hoped to leave open. Sandra Anderson slid the envelope across the counter. Margaret opened it. Margaret read for a long time, methodically, the way a postmistress reads, paying attention to dates and letterheads and the things not said. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a brokerage forensic summary showing the booking had been entered by an assistant named Greta, a single keystroke selecting Harlan View Estate from a drop-down. 11 minutes after she received an email from an anonymous address. Subject line, Harlan Mills caretaker situation, please confirm property and dates. The second document was a printout of that email. Anonymous sender. The body said simply, Mr. Hill is owed a real summer. Harlan Mills is the better lake. The caretaker is alone there with a child and could use the income. Sincerely a friend. The third document was a list of every Hill Hospitality employee whose email signature resembled the anonymous signature line. 2 matches. One a man named Frederick in legal, retired in May. The other, Carol Lee, the family's estate manager, who had raised Scott and Sandra from the year their mother left, and who had, in a faxed letter clipped to the back of the envelope, written to Scott 3 weeks ago on Hill household stationery. If I may, sir, the carriage clock is in the second pantry behind the soup tureen. The housekeeper has been instructed to expect you. The faxed letter had been intercepted in the Hill Manhattan mailroom and never delivered. Margaret looked up. So, Margaret said, your family's housekeeper rerouted your brother's summer to a lake in a village she had picked out for him. And you, Margaret said, have spent 2 weeks blaming a woman who knew nothing about any of it. Sandra, yes, I intended to tell him today on her porch. Margaret said her name, Sandra, and waited until the younger woman looked up. If you tell him this in front of her, he will never forgive you. Not for you, for her. He will be ashamed in front of her for 2 weeks of mistrust he was not aware of being party to. You will lose your brother twice. Once for the mistrust. Once for the witnessing. Sandra stood very still. Where then, at the end of the dock? Where you stood with him the morning of the pancakes. You ask her permission to borrow him. He follows you. You hand him the envelope. You wait while he reads. You take what comes, a pause, and when you come back up the dock, leave the envelope on the porch chair. Laura reads it after he does. She's earned the right to know, Sandra agreed. She took the envelope back. She put the apple pastry in her jacket pocket. She did not eat it. She walked out of the post office into the bright noon, and got into her car and drove out to the lake road. Margaret watched her go, then picked up the phone and dialed Frank Clark at the hardware store next door. Frank, stay close to the lane this afternoon. There is a Hill family conversation about to happen at the end of the old dock, and we do not know how it will end. Stay close. Do not interfere, but stay close. All right, Margaret, Frank said. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the dock warm under bare feet, the sun a brassy weight on the lake. Henry the great blue heron asleep on the far buoy where Wren could see him. Sandra came up the gravel lane on foot from the village. She had taken a room at the village inn without anyone seeing her. She came up the porch steps, did not let herself in. Knocked once on the screen, Laura came to the door. The 2 women looked at one another for a moment that was longer than a normal moment, by exactly the small unit of time it takes a person to decide she will not be the first to speak. Sandra broke first. Miss Clark, I owe you an apology. I would like to offer it separately from the one I am about to offer my brother. May I have permission to ask him to come down to the end of the dock for a conversation I do not want to have on your porch? Laura looked at the envelope, looked at Sandra's face. Yes, she said, but first put the envelope down. I'll give it to him after. Bring the apology without the evidence. Sandra looked at her for a long 3 count. All right, she said. She set the envelope on the porch chair. She walked down the steps. She walked across the yard. She walked down the dock. Scott in the slat-back chair set down the highlighter and stood. They spoke for a long time. From the kitchen, Laura could not hear a word. She watched only the shoulders. Sandra's going a fraction lower than the morning of the pancakes. Scott's hand reaching out once, touching his sister's shoulder, withdrawing. She watched the precise moment. About 11 minutes in, when Sandra stopped speaking and looked out at the lake, and did not speak again for almost a full minute, Sandra came back up the dock. She came up to the porch. She picked up the envelope. She walked it back down to the dock. She gave it to her brother. She walked back up the dock alone this time, and did not come up to the porch. She stood in the yard with her hands at her sides and waited. Scott read. He read with his back very straight, and the watchband pressed white under his thumb and his free hand opening and closing once slowly against the arm of the chair. He read the forensic summary. He read the anonymous email. He read the list. He read the faxed letter from Carol Lee. When he was finished, he set the envelope down. He stood. He walked the length of the dock with his free hand passing once across his eyes. He came up the porch steps. He stopped at the screen. "Laura," he said. "I read it." Laura said, because she had not. But she could see in his face what was in it, and she did not want him to say it out loud. "Whatever it is, we're fine." He stood there for a long moment. The sun was behind him. She could not see his face clearly through the screen. "Carol Lee sent me to you," he said. "On purpose. My sister didn't know. I didn't know. The brokerage error was not an error. All right, it was not an error. Adam, Scott, come inside." He came inside. She closed the screen behind him. She did not turn on the light. The kitchen was full of the long brassy light of late afternoon. Wren was at the dock with Sandra. Wren had walked out on her own when she saw Sandra standing alone in the yard and had taken her hand without asking, and Sandra had not let go. Laura stood in front of Scott in the dim kitchen. She put her hand very briefly on the cuff of his sweater. She did not look at his face. "It's all right," she said. "It's all right?" He pressed his thumb against the watchband. "I don't know," he said quietly. "What to do with this?" She told him he didn't have to know yet. Then she said, "Please don't pay me $1,200. He laughed. It was not the small private exhale of Tuesday. It was a longer laugh, the laugh of a man who has just been given back something he had not known he had lost. Out on the dock, Wren tilted her face at Sandra and said in her clear, precise voice, "Scott has a small smile when he sees you. Did you know?" Sandra said she had not known. "Okay," said Wren. She took Sandra's hand again. The great blue heron on the buoy lifted one unhurried wing and crossed the lake. The Wednesday that changed everything started the way all significant Wednesdays do. Quietly, without warning. With the smell of something so good it reorganized the entire morning around itself, before anyone was awake enough to object. Scott was at the stove. Not the being in the kitchen knew. He'd been eating the occasional piece of toast at the counter since the rain night, which Laura had permitted without making a declaration about it. This was different. This was him at the actual stove. With the cast iron. With the buttermilk batter in the bowl he'd mixed himself, measured from the recipe card she kept under the fruit bowl, which he had apparently committed to memory sometime in the past 10 days. Wren was on the stool beside him. Not directing, observing, which from Wren was a significant professional endorsement. Laura stopped in the doorway. She had come in from the herb bed, hands dirty, her hair doing the thing it did in the morning humidity, the loose pieces at the front going their own way. And she had not been prepared for this. For the specific image of a man in a soft white linen shirt, with the cuffs rolled back making her grandmother's pancake recipe, in her cast iron pan with her daughter on the stool beside him, while the lake went pale and silver through the window above the sink. She was not prepared for how ordinary it looked. Not ordinary like unremarkable. Ordinary like it belonged there. Like the kitchen recognized it. Like the cast iron recognized it. Which was, she understood from the way the first pancake was going in the pan, the edges setting right, the surface bubbling evenly, actually possible, because cast iron had a memory, a seasoning built up over years of use, and the pan was doing what it did when it was handled correctly. And he had figured out the wrist movement. Wren looked up. "The wrist is correct. I can see that," Laura said. "He practiced on Saturday when you were in the village, I know." "He told me. Did he tell you he ruined two?" A pause that was not quite smug but was adjacent to smug. "I helped him with the ratios after the second one." "Sit down, Mama," Wren said, with the authority of someone who has been put in charge of something and takes the appointment seriously. "I'll pour the coffee." Laura sat. She sat because her knees had done something when she walked into the kitchen that required sitting to address. Wren poured the coffee with both hands on the mug the way she'd been taught. The careful two-handed pour of a child who has decided to do something properly and means it, and set it in front of her mother with the concentration of a surgeon setting down an instrument. Scott slid the first pancake onto a plate. He set it in front of Laura without announcement, without the performance of delivery. Just set it down the way you set down something for a person you know well enough to know they don't need ceremony. She looked at the pancake. She looked at him. He was watching her with the expression of someone who is trying very hard not to look like they're waiting for anything in particular. "Try it," he said. She tried it. It was perfect. Better than her perfect. She knew this was the explanation. The cast iron finally seasoned enough to do what cast iron was supposed to do. It was the cast iron. That was the explanation, and she was keeping it. Scott, yes. This is the pancake my grandmother would have made. He took that in. Something moved through his face. Not quite a smile. Not a smile. Something in between that was more honest than either. She said it again, quieter. It is, thank you, he said. Just that. No elaboration. The restraint of a man who understood that more words would diminish the moment rather than add to it. He served Ren. He served himself. He sat down at the table with them. Not at the end, not at a careful distance. At the table with them, the way a person sits at a table they belong at. And the morning had the quality of a thing that has found its natural shape. He told them about the Methodist potluck on Sunday. About Margaret's request for a cherry pie, and his admission that he had never in his adult life made one, and that Margaret's response had been, in its entirety, "Then you'd better start learning." He said this with the dry amusement of a man who finds himself regularly outmaneuvered by a 65-year-old postmistress, and has decided to find it edifying rather than humiliating. Laura said she'd teach him. The sour cherry tree behind the inn. Saturday afternoon, Ren as the official oversight committee. He agreed without any negotiation at all. Different from the first week, when he'd had the micary pause of a man accustomed to evaluating offers. Now he just agreed, like a person who had stopped calculating whether a thing was worth his time, and had started simply noticing whether he wanted it. He wanted it. And then the small silence that smelled of nutmeg and maple, and the lake going blue through the window, and Ren making a sound that was half hum and half satisfaction, and Laura saying the thing she had not planned to say, and was already saying before she'd finished deciding. If a stranger walked into this kitchen right now, they wouldn't know which of us lived in this cottage. Scott set his fork down. He looked at her. He pressed his thumb against the watchband. Not hard. Lightly. The way you rest your hand on something solid when you want to acknowledge it without making a fuss. I know, he said. The kitchen held its breath. Ren took an unbothered bite of pancake. This is the best Wednesday of my whole life, she announced. Mama, can Scott stay until Labor Day? That's Scott's decision, sweetheart. The directness of a 6-year-old who has decided waiting for things to happen naturally is inefficient. Can you stay until Labor Day? He looked at the lake. He looked at Laura. He looked at the small grave person beside him who had named 3 frogs, 2 herons, and 1 porch board. If your mother will have me, he said. I'll stay until Labor Day. I'll stay through the cherry pie. I'll stay through the potluck. I'll stay through whatever comes after. And then, quieter, not performing it, just saying it because it was true. I would like, if your mother will have me, to stay. Okay, Ren said. She took another bite. But he needs to learn the canoe before the long weekend. We can't have a man at this cottage in September who doesn't know the canoe. Laura said he would learn the canoe. He agreed he would learn the canoe. Ren accepted this and returned to her breakfast, and the morning proceeded. None of them knew yet that somewhere down the lake road, on a financial press blog with 200,000 subscribers, a headline was 20 minutes from being published. The phone rang at 10. Scott had walked to the bend in the lane for his weekly call with the Mastern Council. He'd carried the binder, the pen, the phone. He had been gone 28 minutes. The call was supposed to take 45. When Laura saw him coming back up the lane, she knew immediately that something was wrong. Not because he was running. He wasn't exactly running. But because he was moving with a directness that was different from the way he normally moved. The way a person moves when the thing they've been walking toward has suddenly become the thing they need to reach. She stood up from the porch chair. Laura. He came up the steps and stopped. He did not come up to the porch. He stood at the bottom with the binder under his arm and the phone in his free hand and the expression of a man trying to fit something into the shape of a morning that no longer had room for it. I have to go to Manhattan. When? Now. This afternoon. There's a development with the acquisition. The council can't manage it remotely. How long? 3 days. Possibly 4. I'll be back by Saturday. Before the cherry pie, she nodded. She wiped her hands on the apron. All right, she said. Laura. Her name. Just her name. Waited. He would not go if it could wait, he told her. The words came out with the grain of something real in them, not a speech, just a fact he was reporting. She knew he would come back. She said it because she had learned since June that there were 2 ways to send someone away from a porch. One was the way she had sent Marcus in 2019, holding still in the doorway, not saying enough, letting the silence mean what it meant. The other was the way you sent a person away when you wanted them to return. You stood on the porch, you said it out loud. Twice if you had to, Scott. I know you'll come back. He looked at her for a long 3 count. Then he came up the steps. He stopped 1 foot in front of her on the porch. He did not touch her. He pressed his thumb against the watch band. All right, he said. He packed in 11 minutes. 2 leather bags, the flat rod case, the binder. He came back down with all of it. And the town car was already at the bottom of the lane. Margaret had seen him on the lane from the post office window and called for the car immediately, which was not a service Margaret had any official capacity to provide, but which she had apparently arranged with the ease of someone who keeps useful numbers for exactly this kind of situation. He stopped at the porch. Wren, yes, I have to go to the city for 3 days, maybe 4. I'll be back. There's a cherry pie I have to learn to make. He said it the way you say things to children when you want them to know you're taking a promise seriously. Will you keep the boathouse for me? Okay, Wren said. He went down the steps. He loaded the bags. He turned. He looked at Laura once. Just once, for 2 full seconds. And in those 2 seconds something was exchanged that neither of them named and got in the car. The car backed slowly down the lane. 9:50 in the morning. The mist had burned off hours ago. The herons were on the buoy. Albert was on the near buoy. Henry was on the far one, which was new, which Wren noted in the puddle registry under the heading Territorial Shifts Thursday. Laura stood on the porch in her apron and watched the car go. She did not know then that what the Mastern Council could not manage remotely was a tabloid situation. A photograph, long lens, taken from the public boat landing across the lake, the kind of shot that required planning and a specific kind of patience, of Scott Hill on a small cottage dock with a woman in a work apron and a child in a sundress visible through a screen door, eating what appeared to be pancakes. The headline, going up on a financial press blog at the precise moment the town car reached the highway. Hill's quiet summer, Billionaire's acquisition retreat includes lake cottage, caretaker and a child. The second paragraph alleged, without any evidence whatsoever, and with the specific confidence of a publication that had learned that the word alleged was a sufficient legal buffer for whatever came after it. That the child in the photograph might be Scott Hill's, Laura did not know any of that. Not yet. By 6 in the evening, she would. By 6, the Village Inn had 7 journalists attempting to book rooms and 1 more in the parking lot making calls. By 7, Margaret had walked the half-mile to the lake road with a printout of the article and a bag of peach pastries, and had sat at the kitchen table and read the whole thing aloud while Laura stood at the counter and did not move. By 8, Laura had pulled every curtain in the cottage. By 9, Scott had called 4 times. By 10, Laura had not answered. She sat in the kitchen with Wren asleep in the next room, and the curtains drawn and the cottage feeling smaller than it had in months. She read the article again. Read the second paragraph again. Read the word alleged, and the words that came after it, and felt the particular cold that arrives not when something is done to you, but when you realize you may have been wrong about the thing you thought you were doing. Because at 10 o'clock she was certain the photograph was Greta's work. Sandra had told Margaret that afternoon, and Margaret had told her, the only person at Hill Hospitality with the access and the booking system history to engineer. This was the assistant who had clicked the wrong drop-down in April, which meant the whole summer, the error, the arrival, the porch board, the pancakes, the rain night, the watch, all of it, might have been the setup, the long con, the elaborate arrangement of a situation that would produce exactly this kind of photograph, at exactly the kind of moment when a major acquisition was vulnerable to the particular pressure that a personal scandal applied. At midnight she believed this with the certainty of someone who has been here before. At midnight the logic of it felt airtight. Of course it was arranged. Because the things that happen to you in life do not happen because a lake chooses your porch. They happen because someone decided they should happen, and built the conditions for them and waited. She knew this. She had known this since 2019. She had organized her entire life around the knowledge that when something feels like it found you, it usually means you were found. By 2 in the morning, she believed Scott had known. This was the lie. She would understand that later. That 2 o'clock in the morning, alone, with curtains drawn, is the hour when the lie is loudest, when the version of events that requires you to have been used is the only version the sleepless mind is willing to generate. She had been here before. Not this exactly, but the shape of it. The moment when the floor of something you thought was solid turns out to have been a surface painted to look like ground. She did not answer the phone at 4 when it rang. She did not answer at 5. She did not answer at 7, when Scott, who had been up all night in a Glasgow conference room, discovering that the leak had not come from Greta at all, but from a Master Council intern who had been paid $4,000 by the financial blog for a tip, an intern who had been on the dock the day the Harlan Lodge keys arrived and had connected two pieces of information no one had thought to keep apart. Called from the car on the way to JFK. At 8 on Thursday morning, Laura packed a single bag. Not a large one, the small duffel she used for overnight trips, the one that lived under the bed, and that she had not used since the winter workshop she'd attended in Concord in February, where someone had taught her to make lacquered boxes, and she had made 4 and brought them all home and given 3 to Wren, and kept one on the windowsill above the kitchen sink. She left a note on the kitchen table. "Saw Scott. I don't know yet what to think. Please don't come up. Please give me 3 days. L." She drove to her grandmother's house in Saratoga. She drove with Wren in the back seat, and the duffel in the trunk, and the watch in the front pocket of her bag, which she had put there without deciding to. The way you put things in your pocket without deciding to when your hands know something your mind hasn't caught up to yet. The watch was in her bag and she did not take it out. Not that day. The note was the worst thing she had ever written him. She knew that. It was a closed door pretending to be a hinge, the form of an offer without the substance of one. It said 3 days and meant she didn't know how many. It said please and meant something harder than please. It said I don't know what to think, which was true, but the part it left out was the part that mattered. That not knowing was already a verdict, that the asking of the question was itself the assumption of guilt, and that the watch was in her pocket, which was either a contradiction or a confession, and she didn't have the clarity yet to know which. He would read the note 11 hours later, standing in the kitchen where the cast iron pan still had the film of buttermilk on its lip from Wednesday morning's perfect pancakes, the film that had dried and gone pale at the rim and would need to be washed before the pan could be used properly again. He would read it twice. He would fold it on the table beside the key ring. His key ring, the set she'd given him in June with the boathouse key and the Takaich at Gates key and the little cedar fob she'd made from a piece of the old porch board, shaved down to a small rectangle with his pocket knife one afternoon on the dock. He would press his thumb against the watch band so hard the leather creaked. He would believe, because he had been taught by a woman who left on a Tuesday, that affection was temporary, and had spent 11 years building a life on the premise that if you made yourself sufficiently useful, people chose to stay, that he had not been useful enough. He would believe that 2 months of pancakes and porch boards and a single rainy night on a sofa in a parlor that smelled of cedar smoke had not, in the end, been sufficient. He would honor the 3 days. He would honor them because Sandra Atalda had told him at 12 years old that the question of whether someone was coming back was not worth the energy it cost to ask, and he had built his whole adult life on the truth of that sentence, and he was not going to break it now because he was afraid. He would go to Harlan Lodge. He would carry his bags down the boathouse stair for the second time in 4 days, and load them into the town car that Margaret had, once again and without being asked, arranged. He would do one thing first. He would take the watch from his wrist. He would set it on the kitchen table beside her note with no explanation, no accompanying piece of paper. Nothing. Just the watch on the table. The watch his grandfather bought in Hartford in 1962, that his father wore for 6 years, that he had worn for 18. On her table. Because he did not know how to say the thing the watch was saying, and he had decided that not knowing how to say it was not the same as not meaning it. He would get in the car at midnight. He would not look back at the cottage, the boathouse loft door which he had locked. He would leave the key for in an envelope addressed to Margaret Wilson at the Harlan Mills post office. No note, just the key, and on the inside flap of the envelope, in the fountain pen ink that was the only script he wrote in anymore, one sentence: I cannot leave it on a kitchen table that may not be hers next week. Margaret would receive the envelope Thursday morning. She would open it. She would read the sentence. She would sit with it for a long time, the way Margaret sat with things that required sitting with. And then she would put the key in the pocket of her cardigan and wait. In her grandmother's house in Saratoga, Laura spent the hardest week of her recent life. The first day she didn't take the watch out of the bag. She knew it was there. She could feel the slight weight of it against the fabric when she moved the bag. The second day she took it out and set it on the dresser in the room she slept in. The room that had been her mother's room before her mother moved to Albany and before her grandmother had repainted it, a soft green that smelled, in summer, of the climbing rose outside the window, the watch ran. She wound it once by accident, reaching for something else, and felt the slight resistance of the crown and the give of the mechanism, and put it back on the dresser. Wren drew herons, 15 of them in 3 days, all of them recognizable as herons, which represented significant technical progress. The smallest one she labeled Albert. She said nothing about Scott. She said nothing about the boathouse or the cottage or the pancakes. She drew herons and read the 2 library books she'd brought, and sat on her great-grandmother's porch swing, and looked at the Saratoga Street the way she looked at the lake, with the patient, comprehensive attention of someone taking inventory. On the 4th morning, Laura's grandmother came into the kitchen at 6:30 and sat across from her at the table where Laura had been sitting since 5 with a cup of tea she hadn't poured for herself. 81 years old, a long gray braid, the same hazel eyes her daughter had and her granddaughter had and Wren had. 4 generations of the same eyes looking at the world with the same exact combination of warmth and refusal to be told something untrue. "You haven't looked at me directly in 4 days," her grandmother said. Laura looked at her directly. "Good. Now, I'm going to tell you what I've decided about that, and you're going to tell me if I'm wrong." "All right, Gran. You've decided," her grandmother said, "that the man at the lake was a version of Marcus. Yes, you've decided that he came to your porch because someone arranged it, and because he agreed to being arranged. Yes, and in the 4 days since, you have not allowed yourself to ask whether the man you spent 2 months with was the kind of man who would agree to be arranged. You have only allowed yourself to ask whether you can survive being arranged again." The silence in the kitchen had the quality of something that had been building for a long time and had finally arrived at its own surface. "Yes," Laura said. Her grandmother said her name and waited until she looked up. That was not the right question. A pause, not theatrical. The pause of someone choosing words the way you choose tools, for what they do, not how they look. The harder question is this: what did the man on that porch do in 2 months that a man who had agreed to be arranged would not have done? Laura was quiet for a long time. She turned her teacup on its saucer. She watched the tea. He fixed the porch board, she said. Her grandmother waited. He learned the herons' names. He drank the powdered lemonade. He made the pancakes. She stopped. He left the watch on the kitchen table. What watch? His grandfather's watch. The one he presses his thumb on when he's nervous. A pause. The kind that precedes a sentence you didn't know you were going to say until you hear it coming. He left it. I think he left it because he didn't know how to ask me to keep it for him. Her grandmother set down the teacup with the deliberateness of a woman who has made a decision. Laura, her name, said with the specific weight of someone who has been calling you by it for 38 years and knows exactly how much it can carry. Go home. Bring Wren. Bring the watch. If the watch is still on the kitchen table when you get there, leave it. If he's come back for it, you'll see him. But you are not going to spend the second half of August in my back bedroom, believing you were used by a man who left a watch. She drove back on the morning of the 6th day. The lake road was empty. The lane was empty. The cottage was the cottage, unchanged. The porch boards holding in the summer heat, the new cedar planks slightly lighter than the surrounding wood still, not yet weathered to the same gray. She parked and sat in the car for a moment with the engine off and her hands in her lap and the morning doing what it did. She went inside. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it. Except for one thing, the watch was not on the table. She stood in the kitchen and understood this. The watch was not on the table, which meant he had come back, which meant he had stood in this kitchen and found the note. And she looked at the table more carefully and saw it, the small mark on the edge where the watch had rested, a faint impression in the wood's surface that would fade in a week. But was there now? The proof that something had been placed and then picked back up. She picked up the cast iron pan from the drying rack, turned it right side up, set it on the burner. Wren ran through the screen door and across the yard toward the dock, calling for Albert before she'd fully confirmed that Albert was there to be called for. Laura drove into the village. She sat in Margaret's chair by the catalog table and said Margaret's name and asked simply to be told what she had missed. Margaret told her. About the intern and the $4,000 and the leak. About Sandra under the chestnut tree 3 weeks ago with the Polaroid, which Margaret had seen from the post office window, had not mentioned to anyone, and was mentioning now because Laura had earned the information. About Carol Lee, quietly retired to a house on the Sound that Scott had put in trust for her. About Scott at Harlan Lodge for 4 days, not calling, because the note said 3 days and he'd given 4. and then returning to the cottage for the fountain pen he'd left. The only thing he'd left. And standing in the kitchen for 40 minutes before going back down the lane. And the envelope, Margaret said. He sent me the boathouse key in an envelope. One sentence on the inside flap. In fountain pen ink, she reached into the pocket of her cardigan. Set the key on the table beside Laura's tea. Set the envelope next to it. I cannot leave it on a kitchen table that may not be hers next week. Laura read it. Read it again. Set it down. She sat in the chair by the catalog table for a long time. She drank the weak tea. She looked at the sentence on the inside of the envelope flap and thought about a man who had come back for a fountain pen and stayed 40 minutes in an empty kitchen. Margaret, how do I get him back? Margaret looked at her the way. Margaret looked at questions that contained their own answers. You don't get him back. He's already back. He's in Midtown beside his sister, who he's been talking to differently since July. He's been waiting for a phone call he's not allowed to make himself, because he was told in a note to give 3 days, and he gave 4, and honored the rest of it by leaving the watch. A pause. You don't get him back. You call him. You tell him the watch is on the boathouse door hook. You ask him to come back to the lake and put it on his wrist on the porch in front of you. Then you take what comes. All right, all right. She drove home. She called him at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He answered on the second ring. He didn't say hello. He said her name, Scott, Laura. The watch is on the door hook. Margaret gave me the sentence. I'm asking you to come back to the lake and put it on your wrist on the porch in front of me. A pause that lasted exactly as long as a breath. I'm 2 hours out. I'm sorry? I've been in the car since noon. I was going to call from the bend in the lane. I've been past Newport for 40 minutes. I didn't have permission to call before I knew I was coming back, and I wasn't coming back without. He stopped. I'm 2 hours out. All right, she said. Drive carefully, and he said he would, and he hung up. He arrived at 5:20. He did not park the SUV at the cottage. He parked at the village inn and walked the last half-mile up the lake road. No bags, no binder. Nothing in his hands except the fountain pen in his breast pocket, which was the only thing he'd come back for the first time, and which he had apparently decided was the only thing he needed the second time. Margaret saw him pass the post office window. She nodded once. She picked up the phone. He's on the lane. He has nothing with him but a pen. Stand on the porch. Laura stood on the porch. He came up the lane at the particular pace of a man who has walked a long time and knows exactly where he's going and is not going to hurry the last quarter mile, because the last quarter mile is the one that counts. He came up the gravel. He came up the 3 painted porch steps. He stopped 1 foot in front of her. He did not touch her. He pressed his thumb against the bare skin of his left wrist, where the watch had been for 18 years and was not there. Laura, Scott, she held out the watch. He took it. He put it on. He did not say thank you because thank you was not the right word for it, and he knew that. He pressed his thumb against the band once, the old familiar gesture, and lowered his hand. Laura, I need to tell you 3 things. All right. This morning I signed the papers withdrawing from the acquisition. The clause you found was the first fracture. The leak was the second. My legal team and Sandra spent 4 days finding the third, an indemnification rider that would have cost $12 million over 6 years. I walked away. The Master Council is furious. They can't remove me. They'll try. In anticipation of their trying, I transferred half my voting shares to Sandra in trust this morning. She accepted a pause. She also signed a written apology addressed to you. It will be in an envelope for Margaret tomorrow morning. All right. Second, he held her gaze. I have deeded the boathouse cottage and loft and the dock strip to a trust in Wren's name. The trust is irrevocable. The Boston family has been bought out. The main house remains theirs. The cottage, the dock, and the boathouse are Wren's. You are the trustee. The deed was recorded at the county clerk's office this morning, and then before she could speak. I did this before I called you. I did it so that regardless of what you decide about me, you keep this porch. Whatever you decide, that's not part of the decision. That's already done, Scott. That's too. It's not too much. It's what it is. I'm not buying anything with it. I'm not paying a debt with it. I'm closing one door so that if another door opens, it opens because of who is standing on either side of it, not because of a porch board. Quiet, the lake moving. Albert on the near buoy. The cedar plank on the porch the same color as everything around it now. Indistinguishable, exactly as he'd said it would be. Third, he reached into his breast pocket, took out an envelope. I've written a letter. I'm not going to read it to you. I'm going to set it on the kitchen table and leave the porch. You can read it tonight or tomorrow, or put it in the wood stove. The letter is the answer to the question you haven't asked me. about Carol Lee, about my mother, about why a man my age was willing in June to be arranged. He put the envelope through the screen onto the kitchen table. He turned to go. Scott? Yes, wait, he stopped. She looked at him. The late afternoon light was on the lake, in the way it was on the lake in August, the way it had been the first afternoon he stood in the gravel drive with a misaddressed reservation and said the word permit and made something shift in her shoulders that she hadn't invited. The watch was on his wrist. The new porch board was weathered now to match. Wren was calling for Albert from the dock, her voice carrying across the water, the particular sound of a child, certain enough of where she is to be loud about it. I'm not going to read the letter tonight, Laura said. I'm going to read it tomorrow morning with you in the kitchen in front of me after pancakes. If I have a question about it, I'll ask it. If you don't have a prepared answer, you'll tell me you don't have a prepared answer. If I don't have a question, we'll go down to the dock and you'll teach Wren the canoe before the Methodist potluck on Sunday. All right, Scott, one more thing. You can stay in the boathouse tonight if you want. He said her name in the careful voice of a man asking for something he doesn't believe he has the right to require. Was that permissible? He asked. Just that word. Permissible. It's permissible, she said. He went down the steps. He went across the yard. He went up the boathouse stair. The door, which he had locked and left the key for, and which Margaret had unlocked that morning before Laura returned, opened. The kerosene lantern was on the cot, and the blue wool blanket with the small boat embroidered on the corner was folded at the foot. Wren had put it back sometime in the week he was gone, had gone up the stair herself, and placed the blanket that was too small for her now at the foot of the cot, for when he came back, he sat on the cot. He pressed his thumb against the band of the watch. He listened to the water under the floorboards and the rope on the rowboat, and the particular sound the lake made on a late August evening when it had stopped expecting weather, and had settled into the long, quiet breathing of a body of water that has nowhere to be except here. He slept. He slept the way he had slept the night after the rain night, which was to say the way he had been telling himself for years was the way he always slept. Easily, fully, without calculation. Without earning it. He came down the boathouse stair at 8 in the morning. Soft gray sweater, wet hair from the outdoor shower, watch on his wrist. He stopped at the bottom of the stair because the smell of pancakes reached him all the way across the yard, and he stood in it for a moment, the way you stand in a thing you thought you'd lost. He climbed the porch steps. Wren opened the screen from inside. She handed him the cast-iron spatula. You make them now. Mama is reading. Laura was at the table with the letter open in front of her. She didn't look up when he came in. She read it through to the end, set it down, folded it in thirds, put it back in the envelope. She looked at him. He was standing at the stove with the spatula and the look of a man who has said everything he knows how to say and is now waiting in the specific silence that follows that. Pancakes first, she said. He made the pancakes. The wrist movement was the wrist movement. He set the plate in front of her. She tried the first bite, and it was perfect. It was the same perfect it had been on Wednesday, and she looked up at him and he was watching her with the expression she had stopped trying to classify because she no longer needed to. You didn't ask me a question, he observed. No, a beat. Are you going to? She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter, which was the answer to every question she might have asked, written in the voice of a man who had decided that the only thing left to offer was the undefended truth. She thought about the watch on the table. She thought about the sentence on the inside of the envelope flap. She thought about the word permissible and the word permit and the long chain of small, careful acts that had connected June to this exact August morning. No, she said. I'm not going to ask a question. I'm going to teach you the canoe before the potluck. I'm going to make a cherry pie with Wren on Saturday. I'm going to set a third place on Sunday morning. I'm going to keep the letter in the cedar chest in the parlor. She set her fork down. If I have a question in October, I'll ask it then. If I don't, I won't. I think that's my answer. He pressed his thumb against the watch band. All right, he said. Eat your pancake. He ate his pancake. The Methodist potluck on the last Sunday of August ran from noon to 5 on the Harlan Mills Village Green. 16 casseroles, 4 pies, the sheet cake that Eleonora had baked for this potluck since 1979 and would continue to bake until she decided not to. 2 of the 4 pies were cherry. One of them was Margaret Wilson's. One of them was Scott Hill and Wren Clark's, made in the cottage kitchen on Saturday, with the sour cherries from the tree behind the inn, and a lattice crust that Wren had designed and executed. herself with the focused ambition of someone attempting something for the first time who does not intend to fail. The lattice was uneven. The pie was, by a consensus that formed without anyone organizing it, the best of the four. Sandra drove up from the city for the potluck. She wore the navy linen jacket. She brought a bottle of lemonade, which she explained was the kind from the powder, and which was, in fact, exactly the kind from the powder. A joke she had been saving since the Sunday of the pancakes, which was the Sunday she had not been ready to make yet. Across the village green, Laura looked at her once. Sandra looked back, and the two of them did the small, private thing of women who have decided to be family without having needed to hold a vote about it. Margaret stood at the center of the long folding table and said in her postmistress voice, the one that carried without being raised, "The lattice is uneven. The cherries are good. The pancakes, I am told, are better than Laura's now, and Sandra, frankly, has been wearing the same navy linen jacket since June, and it is time for a new one. That is the report. Eat your pies." She did not call it a wedding. She did not call it an engagement. She called it the village potluck, which was what it was. And Harlan Mills did not require a name for the thing they had already decided to call neighbors. That evening, after the lemonade and the uneven lattice pie, and the children running between picnic blankets in the August dusk, Scott walked back up the lake road with Laura and Wren and Sandara. The four of them stood at the end of the dock and watched the moon come up over the lake for the first time, as something that didn't have a name yet but didn't need one. The watch was on Scott's wrist. Wren was leaning against his arm in the specific boneless way of a child who has decided a person is safe and has stopped performing anything about it. Sandra had her hands in the pockets of the navy jacket that she was in fact going to replace, but not yet. Albert was on the near buoy. Henry was somewhere further out, which was new, which Wren noted mentally for the registry. Nobody said anything for a long time. The lake was the lake. The moon doubled on the water. The crickets under the dock kept time. On the first Saturday after Labor Day, Wren canoed from the dock to the buoy by herself. Just Wren. In the life jacket she had selected herself, yellow, the brightest color available. With the paddle she had personalized with a strip of blue electrical tape around the grip that she said was for grip, but which was clearly also aesthetic. Scott stood on the dock and watched her go. Laura stood beside him. The boathouse behind them had a new second porch board, alongside the first one now, both cedar, both weathered together to the same gray, indistinguishable from the boards that had been there since Gerald Marsh built the place. The brass key hung on the hook by the screen door. The watch was on Scott's wrist, and sometimes wasn't. Sometimes it was on the windowsill above the kitchen sink when he made pancakes, which he made every Sunday now, which was the tradition now, the way things become traditions when they happen enough times that no one can remember when they didn't. Wren reached the buoy, waved. He turned to look at Laura. He looked at her the way you look at the thing you have been moving toward, slowly and without being certain that it was real until it was close enough to touch. And then he said the thing he had been keeping for this dock, this morning, this light. "Laura, I'm at the right house." She looked at the lake. She let a moment pass, the kind of moment that deserves a beat before you answer it. "I know," she said. The lake breathed. Albert lifted of the buoy without hurry and crossed to the far shore, which was somewhere he had not gone before, which was new, which was the beginning of something the registry would need a new page for. Wren in the yellow life jacket named the wind. The summer had ended. The cottage was theirs. The watch kept time.